I can see that the number's still creeping up, but I think we'll get going. And we may find that there's a few more join the webinar before we get into full swing, but I'll start off. First of all, I'd just like to say hello to everyone and to welcome you to the Clean Arctic Alliance's webinar, Polar Fuels from a Concept to a Solution to Reduce Black Carbon Emissions from Arctic Shipping. As we get going, I'd just like to mention a couple of housekeeping matters to start off. First of all, please note that the webinar is being recorded and it will be made available after today on our website. This is the second time that we're running this webinar today, though with different speakers, so it will be a little bit different to the one that we ran earlier in the day. This is to accommodate different time zones, and since we have different speakers, you might be interested to listen to the other one as well. They will both be up on the website in due course, so please feel free to watch both of them if you want to go back and watch this one again, or to watch the other one as well. And then the second housekeeping point is, if you have any questions, could you please try and indicate to who your question is directed? And then submit any questions via the Q&A option, which I believe will be at the bottom of your screen. For me, it's on the right-hand side. Hopefully it's the same place for most people. We will have time for a Q&A session towards the end after the presentations, and we'll do our best to answer all of the questions then. I'm going to start off just with a few words to effectively set the scene and the context of this webinar. And then I will introduce the three speakers. I'm going to introduce them all in one go up front. And so each speaker will then hand to the next speaker rather than me having to jump in and out all the time. And then once everyone has spoken, we'll move to the Q&A session. So just to get us going and to give a little bit of context for the webinar, black carbon is widely recognised to be a super pollutant because of the outsized impact it has on both human health and on the climate, and particularly when emitted in the Arctic. It has an impact that is around 1,600 times the impact of an equivalent amount of carbon dioxide on a 20-year global warming potential basis. And earlier this year, it was reported that together with methane and ozone, black carbon has contributed to nearly half of the global warming experience to date. In March this year, never had the Arctic seen as little winter sea ice as it did this year. And it's clear that we are losing the polar regions. This is in part due to black carbon emissions. And this isn't just a problem for the people and the wildlife of the Arctic, but for the whole global population, since the polar regions are the greatest regulators of global climate. As the ice has retreated over the past decade, shipping in the Arctic has increased. In terms of numbers, it's increased by around a third, while the distances being sailed have more than doubled. And recently, a new commercial container route was announced from Southeast Asia via the Northern Sea route to Europe. And in fact, the ship has left port in China and is now en route to Europe via the Northern Sea route. Increased shipping in the Arctic is inevitably leading to an increase in climate pollution and health impacts in the region, particularly as a consequence of emissions of the super pollutant black carbon. Black carbon emissions, however, can be reduced simply by choosing to use cleaner fuels. Early in 2026, the IMO's Pollution Prevention and Response Subcommittee meets with an opportunity to discuss concrete proposals on the use of polar fuels as a measure to reduce the impact of black carbon emissions on the Arctic. But for this to happen, proposals need to be submitted to the meeting, and the deadline for those proposals will be in December this year. So what fuels would be suitable for use in the Arctic? There's been a lot of discussion around polar fuels, and a number of issues have been identified which would benefit from further deliberation, including the impact of black carbon on the Arctic and on health, the characteristics of those fuels that might be suitable for use in the Arctic, the opportunity of using polar fuels, both in terms of availability and in terms of switching backwards and forwards between traditional residual fuels and lighter, cleaner fuels. There's been questions asked around the impact of emission control areas that have recently been designated and what the choice of fuels for use in the Arctic will be as a consequence. And also there are questions and discussion needs to be had around the scope of any measures seeking to reduce the impact of black carbon on the Arctic. I anticipate that we will touch on all of these issues during today's webinar, and in doing so, we can share perspectives and contribute to a shared understanding of so-called polar fuels for use in the Arctic as a way of reducing shipping's climate impact and its impact on the Arctic. I'm going to introduce the three speakers now, and as I said earlier, we'll pass straight from one to the other, so I'll introduce them all in one go, and then we'll get started. First to speak will be Kay Brown. Kay is the Arctic Policy Director at Pacific Environment, and she develops Arctic policy with an Alaskan perspective. She is a former state official, political strategist, and media specialist who has lived in Alaska since 1976. She has broad experience in political, nonprofit, and public arenas, including 10 years of service as an Alaskan state representative. After leaving legislature, she helped assemble and lead a large coalition of Alaskan environmental groups, including the Alaska Conservation Alliance and voters, with a membership of 45 groups representing more than 45,000 individuals. She has also served as the Director of Oil and Gas for the state of Alaska and Executive Director of the Alaska Democratic Party. A journalist by training, Kay is the founder and chair of Alaska Women Ascend, a training program for progressive women candidates and campaign staff. She was inducted into the Alaska Women's Hall of Fame in 2017 for achievement in public policy and politics, and holds a Bachelor of Arts in Journalism from Baylor University. Kay will be followed by Andrew Dumbrille. Andrew is the co-founder of the Canadian NGO Equal Roots, which centres communities and rights holders to build a decarbonised maritime industry that focuses on human rights, ocean health, and climate equity. He has spent over 25 years working with environmental NGOs at both a national level in Canada and internationally at the Arctic Council and the International Maritime Organization. He focuses on policy development, which reduces pollution and emissions in the marine shipping sector, and works with civil society and Indigenous organizations on advocacy and campaign implementation. And then our final speaker will be Bill Hemmings, who is technical advisor to the Clean Arctic Alliance. Bill is based in Brussels and works independently on shipping and aviation, air pollution, and climate issues, and advises the Clean Arctic Alliance on fuels and black carbon emissions. He has previously been involved through the Clean Shipping Coalition on major IMO decisions within the framework of MARPOL Annex 6 on air pollution and on addressing ship greenhouse gas emissions. So those are our three speakers. I will hand over now to Kay, and then Kay, please, when you're finished, hand over to Andrew, etc. Thank you very much.
With the Arctic warming at alarming levels, upending global climate systems, the moment has come for action. Our coalition, the Clean Arctic Alliance, understands that the melting Arctic, the snow and ice and glaciers, has reached a crisis point and that we need urgent action to start addressing or continue addressing this complex situation. Arctic warming is accelerating, and one of the major causes is black carbon. Unchecked black carbon emissions from Arctic shipping represent a clear and present danger to the integrity of the Arctic cryosphere, global climate security, and the health and well-being of Arctic indigenous and coastal communities. And so we're urging that action be taken by the International Maritime Organization as soon as possible to reduce black carbon emissions from shipping in the Arctic. Pacific Environment recently put out a report that succinctly and comprehensively addresses these issues and why it's necessary and urgent to get on with solutions. This report on thin ice, published a few months ago, looks at the sources, documents them, and the environmental and health impacts and policy gaps surrounding the issue, and makes the case for immediate action. As Sean mentioned, Arctic shipping is expanding, and the climate superpollutant black carbon goes into the air and then settles in ice and snow, accelerating dangerous melting and reducing the region's reflective albedo effect. Almost 15 years after pledging action, the United Nations Maritime Shipping Body, the IMO, is still ignoring the simple solution to require ships to immediately switch to cleaner fuels. The black carbon soot that's coming out of smokestacks is a powerful, short-lived climate forcer. It has small particles, particulate matter. They have a relatively brief lifespan in the atmosphere, but a very high degree of warming potential compared to some of the longer-lived greenhouse gases like carbon dioxide. Cutting black carbon emissions will result in immediate climate benefits that slow warming in the Arctic and improve public health. Maritime shipping is one of the world's top climate polluters. At any given moment, there are more than 100,000 merchant ships on the water moving 90% of world trade. And these burn primarily the world's dirtiest fossil fuels that emit more than 1 billion metric tons of climate pollution a year, and that's rising. International maritime shipping is one of the big emitters of greenhouse gases, and by consuming residual fuels, the dirtiest of all transport fuels, is also a major source of black carbon. There are a number of warning signs that let us know it is urgent to take this action. Arctic temperatures have risen significantly faster than the global average since 2000. Some areas of the Arctic are already experiencing temperature levels at more than 2.5 degrees Celsius relative to pre-industrial levels. And keeping the global temperature increase below 1.5 Celsius, which has been a major goal of the international community, may already be beyond reach, considering the current and planned fossil fuel infrastructure and developments. This slide summarizes why we're doing this and what it is exactly that we're asking. We're pointing out that we have an immediate crisis that affects not only the Arctic, but the whole globe. And we're asking that the IMO switch or require ships operating in the Arctic to switch from residual fuels to distillate fuels, which are cleaner. This can take place this spring, and when the Pollution Prevention and Response Subcommittee, PPR 13, meets and makes a recommendation to their parent committee, the MEPC, Marine Environment Protection Committee, which is meeting later in the spring in late April. And at that time, we hope that this action is addressed. One of the issues that has been debated and considered in relation to this action is where should this mandate for cleaner fuels apply? And this map shows the distribution of black carbon emissions in the Arctic in 2021. And those are in the purple. And one of our goals is to capture as many of these emissions as possible, and therefore a broad boundary is needed. We're recommending the boundary shown in the green line, which is the Arctic Human Development Report designated geographic area. And this, known as the HDR Arctic, was defined in a prior process that was led by the Arctic Council. So there has been broad consideration and development of where these Arctic conditions exist and where a regulatory line would make sense. The mandate to use cleaner fuels should apply in this area and should be adopted by a mandatory MARPOL Convention amendment that would require the shift to distillates. Whoops. In addition to emitting black carbon, or in addition to emitting CO2, maritime shipping emits black carbon, which in the Arctic is a major contributor to rapid sea ice decline. Climate impacts are addressed on this slide. As Sian mentioned earlier, black carbon's warming impact is much, much greater, more than 1,500 times greater than carbon dioxide. And darkened surfaces absorb more solar radiation, therefore accelerating the melting and the freshwater runoff from glaciers into oceans. These effects trigger feedback loops that are amplifying regional melt, disrupting weather patterns, and leading to more frequent and intense extreme weather events, not only in the Arctic, but in other parts of the world. Glacier melt and sea ice decline can disrupt major ocean currents, such as the Atlantic Meridional Overturning Circulation, known as AMOC, with cascading effects on weather patterns in the mid-latitudes. Disruptions go beyond the Arctic, and there's research linking Arctic sea ice loss to shifts in summer monsoons in India, warmer atmospheric temperatures in Central and East Asia, and anomalous cold fronts in North America. Accelerated Greenland ice cap melting also contributes to global sea level rise, threatening low-level coastal and island communities around the world. Beyond its climate impacts, black carbon also poses acute human health risks and threats to food security for indigenous and coastal communities who rely on subsistence resources. And these acute public health effects include increased rates of cardiovascular disease, respiratory illness, and premature mortality from carbon increases in the air pollution. And it degrades air quality, impacts traditional food sources through loss of sea ice, where subsistence hunting takes place, and it exacerbates existing health disparities among indigenous and remote populations. As mentioned, shipping is increasing, and therefore black carbon emissions are increasing. Between 2015 and 21, Arctic shipping-related black carbon emissions roughly doubled. And that globally, roughly 20% of shipping's total climate forcing comes from black carbon. The rapid retreat of Arctic sea ice is unlocking new Arctic shipping corridors, such as the Northwest Passage and the Transpolar Sea Route, and also extending the season of the Northern Sea Route, and other commercial activity is now accelerating, as Sian mentioned in the beginning. All of this increased traffic highlights the increased risk of spills and harmful emissions, threatening health and ecosystems and livelihoods. Black carbon has an outsized impact in the Arctic. It's a problem elsewhere, but its impact is even larger in the Arctic. One of the primary reasons being the loss of the albedo effect. So despite more than a decade of debate and technical discussion and calls for voluntary measures at the IMO, black carbon emissions from Arctic shipping continue to grow unabated. Black carbon from Arctic shipping remains unregulated with only a voluntary resolution and guidance in place. So we believe it's necessary to get an immediate mandatory switch for vessels operating in and near the Arctic to cleaner polar fuels such as marine distillates, DMA and DMC. These offer a ready solution that could significantly help reduce black carbon emissions in the Arctic and slow down Arctic warming. Absent mandatory requirements, markets lack the certainty that they need to shift their operations toward options that emit less black carbon. So the IMO has the opportunity to enact a high impact policy that achieves immediate benefits, and we urge them to do so starting with the PPR 13 meeting in February and to continue that work into the spring with the adoption of a treaty amendment. Thank you. I'll now hand it over to Andrew.
Thanks very much, Kay. That was an incredible overview of the issue, and I won't, or I try not to repeat a lot of what you said, although I may do a little bit of that, which helps. Um, so I was asked to give a Canadian perspective on this issue, on polar fuels and on black carbon. Just before I launch into this, I mean, obviously, I'm not speaking for the Canadian government. I'm going to characterize some of the Canadian reality and some government positioning around it. I'm also going to give a bit of a perspective on Indigenous approach to this issue. And again, of course, this is even more to the point that I'm not speaking for Indigenous organizations or Indigenous peoples, but I'm going to characterize what some have said within this context to help on the issue. And as thanks, Sean, for the good introduction. I'm just outside of Ottawa on unceded Algonquin and Anishinaabe territory, and it's great to be here with everybody today. Okay, first slide is on the Canadian Arctic shipping, and this graph was taken from presentation that Michelle Sanders did at the Arctic Information Forum at the IMO. It's publicly available, and it's based on Canada's Marine Emissions Inventory Tool, which is a Environment and Climate Change Canada public tool that anybody can actually go into and look at Canadian emissions. And you'll see that emissions in Canada are following the same track of increasing. You'll see the COVID years there where it dipped down. And this, this information, it's also interesting to see the domestic and international and how they've wavered over the years. And this was part of the narrative that Canada used in or their rationale for supporting the HFO ban and for the new emission control area in Canada. The second slide is also taken from that presentation that Michelle did at the Arctic Forum. And this is quite interesting look at business as usual versus if there's an emission control area in place and SOx, NOx, PM, and black carbon. As you can see, the emission control area dramatically reduces pollutants when it's in place versus business as usual by 59% black carbon by 2030. And I'll also say here that even though black carbon isn't in the regulatory framework of an emission control area, and that it's not in any national Canadian emission regulatory framework, it's a co-benefit of the emission control area coming into place. And Canada was very clear that that was one of the rationales for designating the emission control area. And because in Canada there was an emission control area south of 60, and for equity reasons and for just these pollutant reasons, that was the backstop for that initiative. So a bit of a Canadian perspective here too. As an Arctic country with heavy shipping interest and a climate leader, Canada's voice really matters in this context. And as I mentioned, Canada has been a leader in adopting the heavy fuel oil ban and the emissions control area in Canadian waters, which will come into effect in 2017. And so I think there's many questions about, well, what does the polar fuels, get Canada, with both the heavy fuel oil ban and the emission control area coming into place. So supporting that regulation would showcase Canada's leadership. It was close compliance loopholes, mainly scrubbers, after 2029, incentivize the homegrown fuel industry, and set a foundation for global black carbon reductions. In a way, that's our pitch, to Canada, to add on to the leadership, measures that have been already put in place on the heavy fuel oil ban and the emission control area, to go one step further and to start to regulate polar fuels at PPR 13 coming up. So just before, as I transition into an Indigenous perspective, put this map again. This is Kay lent me this for this presentation. And from a Canadian perspective, I think there's a couple things to note. Again, the two lines, the polar code boundary is the yellow line, and the AHDR boundary is the green line. The emission control area in Canada covers all of Hudson Bay, so that should be noted too as background to this discussion. However, you'll see that the polar code boundary doesn't include Nunatsiavut, Eastern Inuit area, but the HDR boundary does. And I think that's an important consideration for Canada and for the reality around Arctic shipping. The polar code boundary isn't culturally sensitive, and it's not environmentally sensitive, and it doesn't capture the full comprehensive impact from black carbon on the Arctic and on its people, most importantly. So a more expanded definition, which is the HDR, which is a very accepted definition, is one that we feel is appropriate in this context, not only from an environment, but from a cultural point of view, which it would include Nunatsiavut. So, yeah, so this is what, from an Indigenous point of view, and again, I'm not speaking for Indigenous people or Indigenous organizations, but we heard the Clean Arctic Alliance has been doing virtual engagement sessions throughout the summer. There's also something called an High Ambition Black Carbon Coalition, which is an informal group of states that have been convening. And the first bullet point here is what we heard from Indigenous representative on the importance of sea ice, the importance of shipping and the potential impacts, the importance of a clean ocean, and the human element, and Indigenous rights and sovereignty and the right to clean ocean and harvesting, and how that is an important factor in this issue. Many of us characterize the black carbon and shipping issue as really at the intersection of the triple planetary crisis of pollution, climate, and biodiversity. Black carbon impacts sea ice, so that's biodiversity. It impacts people, harvest rights, and Inuit way of life, and it's pollution. It has health impacts, and it has climate impacts, which you've heard very articulately explained by Kay. And so you know, from our Indigenous friends and representatives, we often hear about this people-centered approach to regulations and around shipping, and it's really essential in this discussion. And also, particularly Inuit Circumpolar Council has been leading the Inuit voice at the IMO with their recent, congratulations to them on their recent permanent status, the granting of permanent status. And up to this point, they've been active in the discussions around black carbon and the HFO ban, and have been supportive of measures to reduce black carbon, such as polar fuels, as long as cost mitigation planning measures ensure communities will not bear the cost burden of this. And this is a really important point that's stressed over and over again. Inuit communities and peoples are on the front lines of the climate crisis and shouldn't be the ones to carry the burden, the economic burden of solving it. And so that really speaks to the need there. I think this is my last slide, and this builds off of the Indigenous perspective and Canada's rationale for the emission control area. And this is again from that same presentation that Michelle Sanders gave at the Arctic Forum, is to stress the importance of shipping measures which take into cultural impacts, community vulnerable populations, and the health of these vulnerable populations. So I think you can really see how Canada has been a leader here from in a number of ways, not only on the HFO ban and the emission control area, but bringing this issue to Indigenous rights and the right to a healthy environment and the protection of those cultural rights in Canada, but also globally. And that is all from me, and I will hand it over to Bill.
Hello, everyone. We're just moving now from just outside Ottawa back over to Brussels here in Europe. I'm going to try and do the impossible and share my screen for a second. Can you see that? Hope so.
Yes.
Yes.
So I just want to draw out a couple of other things that from what Kay and Andrew said. Andrew pointed out that the yellow polar code boundary was developed by the IMO, and this is the Arctic polar code boundary, really to impose and require special conditions on ships traveling through typically ice-covered waters, because clearly things are more dangerous and they need to make special preparations and special training, etc. And so, some of the areas of Indigenous importance in Canada were not included, not just in Canada, but also down there, you can see at the bottom of the map, below the yellow line, there's Iceland and there's the Faroes and the area off the Norwegian Sea in dark blue. So there's a lot of black carbon being emitted from ships there. And in fact, I won't go into the details, but the ICCT's done a lot of work and showed in 2021 that in this wider Arctic, which includes all this dark blue stuff on the right at the bottom, for ships, large ships over 5,000 gross tons, about 2/3 of the black carbon from the whole of the Arctic picture there comes from ships operating, larger ships operating outside this polar code. You've got to bear in mind that marine fuels at the moment are either basically residuals or distillates, and there's no doubt that distillate fuels are cleaner and cause less pollution, including less particulate matter and less black carbon than residual fuels do. But that doesn't mean to say that distillate fuels from crude oil, fossil fuels, are the complete solution. They're not. But what we're talking about here is, and we're talking in the IMO about a gradual move and hopefully a quick move to cleaner and non-fossil fuels. But in the immediate future, we're talking about moving off these residual fuels onto distillate fuels. A lot of shipping in the Arctic is from fishing vessels. A lot of them are very small and they already use distillates because they can't use heavy fuel oil because they wouldn't, it would just ruin the engine quickly. And so we're talking about larger ships. Some of them just operate up in that area, but a lot of them come in and out of the Arctic from far away. These are large ships. If they're already traveling through an emission control area, either in Europe before they get to the Arctic or in fact in North America, then they have to switch fuels. And the ECA regulations have been around since 2015. Industry's got used to it. Everyone's got used to it. And by and large, we'll talk about that in a minute, the compliant fuel is a distillate fuel. So that's just the background. I want to now go and talk a little bit about Arctic polar fuels. And so I will stop sharing this screen and we're going to move to another slide just while I talk. But there's been some good discussions at PPR over the last couple of years, and we've been having some very good discussions informally with interested observers to IMO, with people in the fuel industry, the shipping industry, with various governments and other environmental organizations, etc. And so I just want to talk a little bit about ISO. ISO and ASTM are two international organizations which develop a lot of fuel specifications for transport fuels. In the case of marine fuels, ISO has had a fuel specification called ISO 8217. You'll see it up on the screen in a minute. Its 7th edition came out in May of last year. And if you're a ship wanting to order a fuel, you'll know all about the ISO specs because they are what you need to tell the fuel supplier is what I want if I want a marine fuel. You're going to see it any minute there now. I think. And when you say I want a marine fuel, you need to tell the marine fuel supplier, this is the ISO specification and this is what it costs, and you'll get an invoice and the fuel will arrive, right? This is a commercial transaction and it happens thousands of times every day. And there's a difference between buying a fuel and governments getting involved in it. And we've got to find the way, if we want to move shipping in the Arctic initially off residual fuels onto cleaner distillates. How do you do that in a way which is mandatory and is a regulatory issue, but you're not going to fiddle around, if that's the right word, with commercial issues. If you buy a car or a TV and something goes wrong with the car or the TV, you don't ring up the government. You go back to the shop or the dealer who sold you the car or the TV, or you go back to the manufacturer, and if there was some sort of a fault, then they'll fix it. And if there has to be financial compensation or whatever else, you sort that out in a commercial framework. It's pretty clear when MARPOL Annex 6 was amended back in 2008 that same principle was applied when low sulfur fuel requirements were introduced in MARPOL Annex 6. And so the IMO said, as from 2020, you're going to have to use a fuel which is no more than 0.5% sulfur. And if you're sailing in an ECA after 2015, you're going to have to use a 0.1% fuel. And if you can see, I'm not going to go into the details. The stuff on the right there with all the green stuff in, it is the specifications in ISO for distillate fuels to comply with what the ISO have proposed to the IMO could be the specifications for a polar fuel. So somehow we have to get all those details there in green into a regulatory amendment which tells shipping, if you're burning residual fuels in the Arctic, you're going to have to move off them, and they're the specs. But to do it in a way which allows shipping and fuel suppliers to continue operating with these ISO specifications on a commercial basis without governments getting involved. If you have any questions on that, I'm happy to answer. So moving initially off residuals to distillates for the larger ships is not a silver bullet, but it is the first thing you do. I mean, I work on aviation. Aviation has been burning distillate fuels for about 70 years. Road fuel and off-road mobile machinery fuel has been using distillates and been required to use distillates for 20 years or more. You know, shipping, we don't want to go into this in great detail, but is using still by and large the dirtiest of fossil fuels, and a lot of it is residual waste, which in fact ends up on the road as tar or on protecting your roof. But why should we allow and tolerate emissions to the air of such dirty fuels, particularly in an environment in the Arctic, which is so critical to climate change globally and to the human health and conditions and living conditions of both people and fauna and flora and sea life in such a sensitive area as the Arctic. I want to move to the next slide and just talk briefly about the options, because as you saw, Kay and Andrew talked about some of the ins and outs of what should the boundary be. And here's another map. It shows in red the Arctic Polar Code, which we talked about earlier, which was in yellow in the other map. The black is 60 degrees north, just showing where it intersects in sea areas, because it's the sea areas where shipping operates that we want to regulate. And what I've added in here, what's been added in here, are the emission control areas. The ones in green around North America and the North Sea and etc. in the English Channel have been around, and the last one in Europe started in 2021. There's actually one now started in the Mediterranean just a few months ago. And you'll see that the Canadian Arctic is covered there in green, as Andrew mentioned. There's a gap then at the south part of the Hudson Bay. It's actually quite a large distance down there. And a bit further down in the other Inuit sensitive area that he talked about. In a couple of weeks' time, the IMO will meet and consider whether a North Atlantic ECA starting from Spain and Portugal down there in blue at the bottom and going right up around Greenland will be approved or not. And so that's a prospective ECA that could be approved in 2 weeks' time, and a lot of us hope it will happen. There's another ECA in green just off Norway there, you'll see, which has been approved and starts very soon. And so one of the things we've got to also think about over the next week and a couple of months before PPR is, what are the impact of these ECAs and new ECAs going to be on black carbon? And the issue really for ECAs is twofold. When the ECA 0.1% sulfur limit was implemented for 2015, everyone when the decision was taken in 2008, said it would be a distillate cleaner fuel. And then we came to 2015 and residual ULSFO appeared and is used mainly in Europe. It's a residual fuel. And in terms of black carbon, it ain't good at all. It clearly is worse for black carbon emissions than distillates. But also, as you know, in emission control areas, you can have scrubbers, and scrubbers can burn heavy fuel up to 3.5%. And indeed, they also are bad for black carbon. And so that's it. We need to talk and think about these issues now, about scope and the impact of developments over the next couple of weeks in the lead up to PPR. I'll leave it there. Thank you.
Thank you, everyone. We'll move now to the Q&A section. We've got around 10 minutes or so for some questions. I'd ask all the speakers, please, if you can just turn on your cameras so that we can see you all. Thank you. And can I just remind everyone, if you do have a question, please put it in the Q&A option, which should be towards the bottom of your screen. We've got a question in there already, so please add some more questions and we'll try and get through them. I think we'll start with the question that's in there already. I'm not quite sure who's best placed to respond to this. Bill, it might be sorry, it's just jumped on my screen and I've lost it. Bill, that you can respond to this initially, but if anyone else wants to jump in, please do. First of all, the first question from Charisse is there any data about the percentage of heavy fuel oil in Russian oil and gas? And then, so what are the implications then, sorry, for the Russian oil buyers, trading partners, many of which are with BRICS countries? Who are also coming in and polluting frontline communities in other parts of the world as well, particularly California in this case. I don't know if, Bill, you're able to lead off on that?
Yeah, in a couple of minutes, it would be very difficult to answer that. If you look at the ICCT work that they've done on black carbon in the Arctic, and you can Google that, and we can certainly send you the reports after this meeting. There's a lot of residual ULSFO in the polar code area, and that's why the HFO ban was also introduced, not as an air pollution issue, but if you spill this heavy fuel oil and residual fuel, it's pretty difficult, disastrous for the environment, but also very difficult to clean up. And so, you know, that focuses virtually all the Russian coast is included in the polar code, and so that will hopefully have an impact. In all these things, you know, in the end, governments have to implement international deals. There isn't any international regulatory force which can require. So we need the coastal countries in the Arctic, including Russia, to do the right thing and move to cleaner fuels. The details we could talk about separately, I think.
Thank you. And another question has come in from Paul Jeffrey. I'm not going to read this all out because it's quite long. Maybe you can have a quick look in the chat. But basically, a product that can be, I believe, from what it says, added to fuel oils that will result in lower emissions of not just black carbon, but other pollutants as well. And asking then whether there are any insights on how to get such a product adopted, either regulatory or commercially, and whether it's possible for NGOs to include the use of vetted fuel additives that reduce emissions, particularly black carbon, as one possible approved solution at the IMO. I would just, Andrew, I can see your hands up, but I'm just going to jump in quickly and say, I feel that isn't the role of non-governmental organizations particularly. Our role is to try and influence the framework that makes decisions about what is acceptable to be used rather than to look at the products themselves. But Andrew, feel free to jump in. Thank you.
Yeah, I was going to very similar answer. You know, I don't know much about this additive, but unintended consequences is always something that is high on our radar around whether it's, you know, fixes like this or with geoengineering, for instance. You know, there's a lot of science that needs to be done and investigation around it. a fuel switch isn't just about black carbon. There's a lot of co-benefits. And, that's the pour point issue from Norway that was brought up at the IMO is a great example of that. And we haven't talked a lot about that here, but part of the suggested, new definition around polar fuels is to include a pour point that is around the zero mark to help with spill response and cleanup and the impacts from that. And so again, an additive wouldn't really operate in that space per se. I guess the last thing is, with scrubbers, such a great example of something that wasn't really thought through and didn't, the unintended consequences weren't analyzed. These types of things do slow down the pathway to decarbonization, right? So if you have a fuel additive that allows you to use bunker fuels will still be used when they really should be phased out, right? And we start to move to more renewable sources. So yeah, there's a lot around that question, and it's not kind of a simple fix around it. So yeah, thanks.
Thank you. Anyone want to add anything? We have got a couple more points here.
Hundreds of ships move every day to distillate fuel whenever they go into an eco. It's not a big deal. It's cost, yes, but the costs are all passed on. If companies don't pass on their cost to consumers, they go broke. It's as simple as that. So this is a quick thing which can be done very quickly for the big ships. Move off residuals to distillates. It's not the perfect solution, but it's step number one. Let's get, after 15 years, let's get at least to step number one.
Thank you. Yes, certainly. And I think that the comment here as well is that this additive would still be valuable with distillate fuels too. So something to look at, certainly. But as I say, I think our role is to try and make sure that the framework is there that results in reduced emissions, and then how the how of how it's done is for the industry to make those decisions within reason. As Andrew says, we don't want unintended consequences. Charisse, I'm not sure if your subsequent points are really more for information or questions, but there's two further points here. One that MOL is working on low SOx fuels for information, and then there's been a lot done or work done around solar SMR surface albedo effect. Again, perhaps more for information than questions as such, but if anyone would like to add anything in relation to those comments. If not, I'm going to throw in a quick question of my own. We've only got a few minutes left, so we haven't got very long, but one of the obvious pushbacks is the economic impact of changing to different fuels. But there's also an economic impact of not changing to different fuels. And Kay, you talked a little bit about the health impacts of black carbon emissions as well. So I just wondered if anyone's got any thoughts around the economic angles in relation to cleaning up fuels. Okay, did you want to come in, or Andrew? Andrew, I can see your hands up.
Sorry, I don't want to monopolize. Maybe Kay, just quickly, and I can hand it to Kay. Just my point around the costs to communities and the call from Indigenous groups to organizations to not bear those costs, and for cost mitigation strategies to be in place is very key. And many organizations in Canada have been calling for that. And I know in Canada the work is underway to develop those frameworks, and so Inuit communities aren't burdened with the switch. Yeah, over to you, Kay.
Well, historically, we see wide swings in the price of oil and in the price of fuels, and those swings do not seem to have major effects on the prices of delivered products. They are somehow absorbed into the cost of these operations. And so generally, I think we can predict and examine and see from history that these cost impacts of switching fuels is relatively modest. And is outweighed by the other more pressing and long-term and systemic impacts on health and the climate that are not being incorporated by industry into their calculations of profitability.
Very quickly, residual crude oil costs about $70 a ton, right? Refineries refine it and you have sludge and rubbish at the bottom called residuum, right? If the refinery just dumped that outside their front door, they'd go to prison very quickly because we'd all be up in arms, right? But instead, for the marine fuel industry, they sell the stuff to shipping at a loss at about 4. So they buy it for 70, they process it and they sell it at 40. And then ships put it into scrubbers and then dump it in the sea. There's something wrong with all of this. It's not logical, is it? Let alone environmental.
I'm going to jump in now. Thanks, Bill. We're coming to the end. We've only got a couple of minutes left, and I'd just like to say a couple of words in terms of wrapping up. So up on the screen in a moment, we are going to just put a few brief take-home messages that are very much based on the Clean Arctic Alliance's thinking around the discussions that have been happening recently, both since the IMO meetings earlier this year and during the course of the webinar as well. So I think there are some clear takeaways from here. There's obviously an opportunity for PPR, the Pollution Prevention Response Subcommittee of the IMO, to address this issue at its next meeting and to start making some decisions around reducing black carbon emissions from shipping in the Arctic. I think it's clear we have a good understanding of the wider Arctic fuels, what is meant by that, what fuels would qualify, and the contribution that these fuels can make to reducing black carbon emissions. Further discussion is clearly needed around the geographic scope of any measure that might be promoted or adopted even to address black carbon emissions, but also we're going to have anything agreed, we're going to need to have some exact wording in front of us, some legal text that would introduce polar fuels and potentially amend MARPOL Annex 6. And in order for all of this to happen, we need an IMO member state to present a proposal to PPR 13. I think it's clear that the shipping sector, the energy sector, the fuel sector, the NGOs, the environmental NGOs can all put forward their views, but at the end of the day, it's a member organization and we need the members to step up and to take a lead here. So that's it in terms of today's webinar. Thank you very much. I'd like to just take this opportunity to thank our speakers, in particular, Kay, Andrew and Bill. I'd also just like to thank the participants today for joining us and also for providing questions in the Q&A and contributing to the discussion. As I said at the beginning, it's our intention to make the recording of the webinar available on our website, and the details will be circulated to all participants. I appreciate that there's a few more comments in the Q&A, and we will look at those and take them away with us as well. I'm sorry that we've run out of time, but we are past the hour now. And if anyone has feedback on whether this has been valuable or how we could perhaps organise more or further discussions that might be useful, please do contact us. The details are up on the screen at the moment. And we welcome any feedback really on how to try and make some progress on this important issue. So thank you, everyone. Lovely to see you and hope you join our next webinar. Thank you.